Welcome to another episode of the BS Podcast, the show that looks at how behavioural change insights are being applied in the wild. Episodes feature renowned behavioural experts across industries and organisations, from management and marketing to policy and public health, and more. Let's dive in and see what all the BS is about. Here's your host from The Behaviourist, Nick Hobson.
Hello, BS listeners, and welcome back to another episode. Today, I'm excited to have Greg Davies on the show. Greg is a specialist in applied behavioral finance, decision science, impact investing, and financial well-being. He founded the banking world's first behavioral finance team at Barclays in 2006, which he led for a decade. In 2017, he joined Oxford Risk to lead the development of behavioral decision support software to help people make the best possible financial decisions. Greg holds a PhD in Behavioural Decision Theory from Cambridge, has held academic affiliations at UCL, Imperial College, and Oxford, and he's author of the book Behavioural Investment Management. Greg is also chair of Sound and Music, the UK's national charity for new music, and the creator of Open Outcry, a reality opera premiered in London in 2012, creating live performance from a functioning trading floor. And we will certainly be getting into that. Greg, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much, Nick. Great to be here.
So you are I have to say this, and I'm not sure I mentioned it in our initial sort of setup and scheduling, but you're the first official behavioral finance expert on the show, which
whatever that may mean.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and that's where I'm going with that. But for what it's worth in titles and names, it's been a long time coming to have somebody like yourself on the show. So really excited. And in any of our behavioral science or economics or behavioral, whatever you call it, subfields, there's sort of the two views that I see. There's the real deal, which we know is complex, and sometimes you have to go and get a PhD to understand all the subtleties and split hairs for a few years before you make it back into practice or business or government or wherever it is. But then the other view is this really oversimplified one when you just Google and maybe you read a Wikipedia page about, in this case, behavioral finance. And my read of the oversimplified view when it comes to behavioral finance is that there's these two types of traders or investors. There's the rational and the emotional, and nothing else. It's this very false, dichotomy, and there's nothing in between. I've also heard you discuss and talk about this idea when it comes to labels and semantics of our field, and the dichotomy of irrational versus rational, and pitting so-called classical economics against our more popular and modern behavioral economics. What do you think? I guess my first question for you, just to kick off, is what are your thoughts on that? Do you struggle with that oversimplification, or is it sort of a necessary evil that we have to deal with because we're bringing our work outside of academia and into practice?
Ooh, a big one to start. So I think whenever you talk about these dichotomies, the rational investor, the emotional investor, the simplified, the deep, the answer is always in the middle. Everything is in the middle. And yes, I do think that there are dangers in the simplification. I frequently rail against these interminably long lists of biases that we see. You go and look them up online, and there's 160 different biases of human decision making. And although it's wonderful and interesting that we know so much more about how we as humans are irredeemably fallible, I think as a tool for practical use, it's completely useless. Because actually, in simplifying, we've swung the other way. Once you've got 160 things that, and I'm just making up the number 160, right? I mean, there could be lists that have more or less on, but once you've got these long lists of biases, each on their own is simple, but they overlap. They conflict with each other. In any given context, in any different environment, they're going to be pointing in all sorts of different directions. So actually, that simplification is not really a simplification for purposes of practical use. It may be a simplification for purposes of disseminating to the world the findings of academia, but it does not help very much for practical tools. And everything then is in the middle. We need to have simpler approaches than I need a PhD in order to merely understand the abstract of this article approach. But equally, the world is complex, and human behavior is complex. And I would say, I mean, to this question of, what is behavioral finance? It's a label. I choose to use it because largely I work in financial services and I work on financial decisions. But everything we do is multidisciplinary and irreducibly so.
Hmm. Hmm. That's great. And when you're talking about the sort of the listicle of all our biases and heuristics, it reminds me of there's a famous, I don't know who did it or who designed it, put it together, but it's a famous picture illustration that people often frame and they put in their office, and you probably know what I'm talking about. It's a brain in the middle,
Yeah.
and it's a very striking figure. Like it's but then sprouting from this brain are all these lines that then
Mm-hmm.
lead to the different. And you know what I will
I
say
use
now
it.
that I'm thinking.
I use that frequently in my presentations as slide number 1 on how not to do behavioral science in practice.
So this is interesting because this is not a common narrative that I hear. Like often what I hear is either this is what it is, and it's people who probably aren't that that informed of the actual field of behavioral science or behavioral economics or psychology, and that's just the very simple toolkit they approach that they use, and they just don't know otherwise. And then there's the other group who they know better, but then they also realize that they have to do some sort of like translation piece to communicate to stakeholders and business partners who aren't scientists or who aren't economists. So does it have, because then you're saying it's not of great use to us in a practical setting, but what about when it comes to, just to push you on that further, what about when it comes to those conversations with people who have only, maybe they've read Nudge, but they don't have any sort of experience or background, and you have to convince them to to engage in a project
Yeah.
or do this work with you?
Look, there are always times when you want to reference a specific bias or a specific heuristic or a specific academic approach. But I think starting from a list of here are my 10 favorite biases this week is almost invariably the wrong thing to do. What you need to do is start from the problem you're trying to solve. So, I am today focusing on how to help investors make better investment decisions, or how to help people save more for retirement. And in the course of thinking through that problem, some of these approaches and biases and tools will come to the surface, and we can absolutely use those labels to communicate at that point. But the starting point is not, here's what behavioral finance has found out. Let me now go through them one by one and apply it to this problem. The starting point is, what is the problem, and how does my expertise and experience in thinking through this problem, armed with all these things in the background, how does that help me to bring the appropriate ones to bear in the context that I'm working in right now?
Great. And it also reminds me of when we talk about biases and heuristics, it's in this more popular view. And you said it. You said the things that make us irredeemably fallible.
Mm,
It's almost as though they are a bug instead of a feature
yeah.
of our inherent psychology, and that's why I love. There's sort of these evolutionary social psychologists. Chief among them is Marty Hazelton and her team, and she has a wonderful paper, maybe a couple papers, where she completely spins it on her head, and she talks about so-called irrationality and so-called maladaptive responses
Yeah.
and biases and mental shortcuts, and she says they are wonderfully adaptive
Yeah.
for the human species, and if it weren't for them, we probably wouldn't have survived. We would have
Yeah.
been extinct millions and millions of years ago. So why do you think, I know my hunch or my hypothesis is because just the framing that was used in Thinking Fast and Slow and some of the more popular first books that came out, but I think we kind of over anchored, or the pendulum has swung a little bit too far when we talk about biases in this way, that they are bad things. Yeah.
I agree. I mean, firstly, I would avoid. I always avoid at all costs using the terms rational and irrational,
Hmm.
because they mean very different things in very different contexts, and particularly for someone who has a background in economics and quantitative economics. I mean, what is meant by rational in classical finance theory or classical economics theory is not something that any a being who thought of themselves as rational would recognize. So I agree completely. I mean, the trouble is the term bias has a certain amount of it carries a certain amount of baggage with it, but it's also very readily understood. It's very recognized, and if you go right back to the original Kahn-Tversky program, it was always heuristics and biases, and implicit in that dichotomy is that there are things. It wasn't that this thing is a bias and this thing is a heuristic. It is any of these things could be a bias in some contexts or could be a heuristic in another context. And they may be ecologically valid and therefore in certain areas will help us to make decisions faster, that on average will get to a good decision. And that is a heuristic that is very useful for humans to deploy and thus is a very powerful thing. But outside in this different context, because we tend to rely on the heuristic, where there is perhaps an objective right or wrong answer, here, that very same thing that's been useful to us might be harmful to us. And I think of all these things, there's a balance on one side or the other. And we do need to absolutely get away from the bias coding of this. Equally, I also think that we need to be very cognizant that there are certain normative standards to which humans would wish to aspire were they given all the computing power, all the time to make decisions, all the information at their disposal. There are certain principles that we want to get closer to. Now, given that we do have all these constraints, sometimes the heuristics are incredibly powerful ways of getting us really close to the objectively right answer, where there is one, incredibly close to that, incredibly quickly, and in a very emotionally comfortable way. And there are times when it lands us somewhere further away. But we do need to realize that the reason this bias thing has come in is that there are certain standards that we should, in various fields, be thinking about. What objectively can we use to define what good looks like? What is a good decision? What is a bad decision? Because unless we have some idea of that, how do we help people to make better decisions?
Wonderfully said. And it also reminds me of, and I'll be sure to link to this into the show notes for listeners if they're interested, is the work by Gerd Gigerenzer and his team over the last 20 years. And for whatever reason, Kahneman sort of found the popular limelight, and Gigerenzer not so much. And I know they've had their feud over the last couple decades, but the fast and frugal theory of Gigerenzer's work I find very useful to apply what you're saying here and to apply some of that thinking in that framework.
Yeah.
And there's one study in particular where I believe, I'm sorry, I'm drawing into the deep recesses of my brain right now to come up with this. But they were looking at fast and frugal decision making as a sort of cognitively efficient and cheap way to find a mostly accurate, satisfactory answer and outcome with burglars. And the question of what type of house is the best one to break into if you're a burglar. And they looked at sort of experts versus novices and also asked expert police officers to see the best possible answer given the level of expertise and how they relied on certain superficial cues or quick rules of thumb and heuristics to make those decisions. Anyways, it's a really interesting paper, and I'll link to it into the show notes. Not that I'm encouraging anyone to become a burglar or do any sort of breaking and entering. So yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I mean, without wishing to wade too far into that treacly debate, I do feel that all of Gigerenzer's points about ecological rationality and some of these things being very powerful tools and they're fast and frugal, all of that, absolutely agree all of that. I'm not sure that on most of what Gigerenzer says that Kahneman would disagree. So I think very often the debate is one side setting up a rather strawman version of what the other side is supposed to think and then tackling it. It feels a bit one-sided, that entire argument, to me.
I suspect you're right with that strawman. Yeah, totally. Okay, so let's get a little bit into your background and then the work you do. We sort of started off really almost meta science and meta philosophical here, but let's pivot. So were you always interested in the sort of the money side or the investing related behaviors of behavioral science and psychology? And what sort of stuff were you looking at in your schooling and how did you make the transition from academia to practice?
Yeah, I mean, I started as an economist, really, which was partly because it was something that blended quantitative stuff with sort of more humanities, people related stuff, and I didn't ever see myself as a hard scientist or a hard humanities person. And economics, frankly, seemed the compromise that was most easily available when I was starting out. I also, along the side, and that might be an explanation for some of our philosophical digressions so far, I did a second major in philosophy all the way through. So I was
Well, that explains it.
I was most interested uh, in the philosophy of economics. So questions about scientific method, how we come to understand what things are, these questions about normative versus descriptive and prescriptive in the middle. And in addition, particularly questions about rationality and what it means. And the philosophers had one particular, set of takes, and philosophers have written uh, long and very deeply on rationality. And economics had another very narrow and very precise view of rationality. And I suppose it was at the intersection of those two things that got me into behavioral science more broadly. The finance was really an overlay to that. I had, from a more practical sense, always focused my economic work much more on microeconomics than macro. And that leads one very naturally into household decision making. And the most measurable part of that is financial decision making. So the finance was a sort of side angle of view over which to layer all the other stuff.
Mm-hmm. And did you do a dissertation that was specific in that niche, or was it something totally different?
So my PhD was really, I would say, in behavioral decision theory. So looking at sort of deep mathematical models of how we model choice and choice under circumstances of risk and uncertainty. So really taking things like cumulative prospect theory and picking apart the mathematical axioms that underlie that and the implications of that for how we quantitatively measure risk, etc. And that's another place where the financial stuff came in, because the minute you're starting to think about risk and uncertainty, sure, you can do it without reference to money, but it is an awful lot easier when you've got something measurable to work with.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Um, and going back to this point of philosophy, because I myself was a double major, so it sort of makes sense that we're sort of hitting on these points. Not to go too far down that rabbit
Always a
hole.
danger.
It is, I know. Um, so what do you think is the place of philosophy broadly for science, and maybe more specifically within the field of behavioral science or behavioral finance?
Yeah, I mean, it's been years since I touched anything that was pure academic philosophy, so I wouldn't want to do the field any disservices by taking a dated view of it.
It's okay. I don't think I have any philosophy listeners, but it's good of you.
But I do think that the philosophers have an awful lot to say about scientific method and how we arrive at knowledge, and what are the epistemological foundations of what we're doing, etc. I also, in a decision science context, find the philosophy around issues of causality extremely compelling, because in a descriptive way, a lot of what behavioral science are doing in academia is describing the world, and often looking at correlations rather than causations. And the same is true in a lot of what's happening in artificial intelligence research, etc. So, for example, the recent book from Judea Pearl on the Book of Why, where he digs very deeply both into the computer science and the mathematics and the philosophy of causality. I think those sorts of ideas from philosophy can help to advise uh, a lot of the principle-based thinking of what we're trying to do in understanding human behavior and how we would change it, and indeed sometimes where we would change it. And that where is important. So here I think more broadly, philosophy as applied to behavioral science. I said before, everything is in the middle. We have this, another dichotomy that is more or less artificial depending on who you're talking to. But there's, on the one hand, we've got description. I'm going to describe the world. And on the other hand, we have these normative models on how the world should be. And economics and philosophy have always really been very strongly on the normative side. Here's what we mean by rationality. Here's what it means to be rational. here's what good looks like, here's what you should pursue. And a lot of the behavioral science is not taking a stance on any of that. It's going, let's describe the world as it actually exists.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in what I'm doing, you could say, I mean, a lot of people say in the middle is prescriptive. I find that perhaps a slightly narrow term, because prescriptive implies you're telling people what to do. Perhaps facilitative is a better way. But in the middle, what the practical and applied work that we aspire to do is, how do I help people make better decisions? And I cannot do that by focusing either just on description or just on normative models of what the right answer is. I have to be able to go, I need both. I need some normative model of what is objectively good. What should I pursue? Which of these things am I trying to encourage and which am I trying to discourage? And then I also need the description to tell me where and how humans fail to do that and why they fail to do that. And armed with both those things together, what we can say is, here is the star you want to steer by in whatever domain, savings, investment, health behaviors. Here is where we want to get. And we don't always know that with any deep clarity, but we should always strive to define where we're going. And here are the things that prevent us from getting there. Now let us see how close I can get you to it without making you too uncomfortable. And that really is at the heart of, I think, applied behavioral science, is how do I get you closer to the right answer in a way that isn't too difficult for you to attain or to stick with? And that absolutely requires normative approaches, philosophy and economics, to help define a right answer. And it absolutely requires psychology and social science and descriptions of human behavior to help me understand why you're not there already.
I must say, Greg, that is a fantastic answer. It is, and I'm just sort of letting that seep into my brain, because I've been wrestling with that, all my training in academia, and as I made the leap out of academia into practice, is this sort of the distinction between prescription or normative and description, and which I really love, the facilitative.
It's quite difficult to say, though.
Tougher to say.
But it'll never fly in a marketing department.
Yeah, exactly. But it really does hit home with me, at least, and I suspect with some of my listeners. And I've brought this up on a number of occasions in past episodes, and I would dance around it as an answer, and some guests would also dance around it. But I think you really hit it on the nose there, and even throwing in philosophy as useful is a kicker there. So good job on that one. So what I mean, just for listeners who maybe don't have that deep expertise or much knowledge of behavioral finance, could you walk through like a typical case or engagement or project that you do at Oxford Risk, and what the work looks like with your team, and maybe some outcomes or outputs of that work?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, at Oxford Risk, we do consulting work, but we primarily conceive of ourselves as a software builder, as a technology firm, and I suppose in the hashtag fintech space. So we try to take this combination of a deep and thorough knowledge of quantitative finance theory and classical finance theory and portfolio theory, etc., and marry that to hopefully a deep and thorough knowledge of human behavior and behavioral economics, and build that into what you might think of as decision support tools to help guide people through complex decisions in a way that they can make better decisions and get to a good answer comfortably and quickly. Because a lot of financial decision making, even in really simple realms like how do I help people save more, is in fact asking people to make a huge number of trade-offs and comparisons, and there's a lot of risk and probability underweighing the right answer, etc. And people, when they're faced with complex and daunting decisions, typically the first response is, I'll do it next month. And 20 years of next months, and you're not in a great situation. So what we do is we try to build software that will guide people through the complexity of their financial existence, such that they can make decisions that will put them in a better and more secure financial position, better financial well-being. Now, as a particular example, to get a bit more practical, so many of our tools are around financial advice. So we provide tools to financial advisors, and we have some tools that will go, let me help you to assess your client's financial situation, their balance sheet, their future goals, their cash flows, the whole of their financial circumstances, and I'll and package all of that together to help define what is the theoretically right answer for their financial needs. So this is where the economics and the normative model comes into play. Then we go, now let us recognize that the approach of classical finance here just won't work, because the approach of classical finance is, here's the right answer. We told you what the right answer is. If you deviate from that, you're stupid and irrational.
Yeah.
Now, from a behavioral perspective, we would go, actually, it's not even the whole right answer, because people have more than just monetary objectives. And one of my non-monetary objectives is the need to feel emotionally comfortable with my investing over the course of the investment journey. And indeed, if I'm not emotionally comfortable, I'm also going to end up making mistakes on my financial returns. So we need to recognize that the real question is not just what is the right answer, but how do I then build tools to establish which bits of that right answer are going to make you emotionally uncomfortable? Which bits can I predict that you will react to in an emotional way over the course of the investment journey? Indeed, where exactly are you likely to hand over the reins to your system one emotional self, short-term self, and shoot your long-term deliberative financial self in the foot? And the way we do that is we use psychometric techniques using data from thousands of people that we elicit responses to on hundreds of different questions. And we use these psychometric and statistical techniques to derive measures of multiple dimensions of people's financial personality. And each of these measures will tell me something about that person's tendencies or proclivities to behave in certain ways or to be uncomfortable with what we've already decided is the right answer. And once I know that, I can start to tweak the right answer to make it more palatable to you. Or more importantly, I can communicate with you better over the course of the investment journey because I know something about your individual personality. And by using that to know, what do I talk to you about when? How do I talk to you about risk? What sorts of things do I tell you about the markets in a way that what it is doing is it is narrowing the gap between the sensible decision for your financial needs and the emotionally comfortable decision, because this is the tension. Forget about the 160 biases. This for me is encapsulates almost all of financial decision making. Is we are constantly, every one of us, walking a tightrope between the sensible thing to do and the emotionally comfortable thing to do in the moment. Mm-hmm. And the classical finance approach is, well, just do the sensible thing. Ignore your need for emotional comfort. Our approach would go, actually, needing emotional comfort is perfectly reasonable. It's perfectly rational. The question is, how much are you paying for it? And so if we can help people by providing them with these decision support tools that go, I've measured your personality, I know what the right answer is for you. Now let me lead you step by step through a decision so that you can comfortably arrive at a place that is right for you and that you're more likely to stick with. And then we will communicate with you over the investment journey in the way that buys you the maximum emotional comfort for the risk that you're taking. Then we really help people to get into a better place.
That's fantastic. A couple points just come to mind right away. First is you talk of like sort of the emotional comfort, and it's totally rational. It's totally reasonable for somebody to want that. But there's boundary conditions and things that matter if you look at a different time scope, timelines and time horizons. Something else that I can imagine is, and definitely true of me and any friends or family I talk to, is that you're not only are you sort of wrestling with those trade-offs as an individual person, but you're also doing it with a partner, with kids, with spouses, with family members, with parents, which can get talk about getting even more like exponentially complex, because it's not just the emotional comfort of yourself, but you're also balancing the needs and the emotional comforts of a loved one or loved ones.
Yeah.
Does that factor into the work that you guys do?
It does absolutely, and that goes through typically goes through yet another lens, which is for many people, they will have all of that complexity, and then they will be talking to a financial advisor who needs to then consolidate all of that and come up with the right answer for this person, given for the set of people, given the whole complexity of their financial world, plus the complexity of all of their interrelationships and their financial personality on 15 different dimensions, etc. So it is a fiendishly complex thing. Now, one of the things that becomes important there is the more complexity you add, the more space there is for bias. And here I do mean bias, because if we've already established that there is some form of a good portfolio we want to get for, or a good investment solution, the more complexity you've got, that the more opportunity there is to err in various ways. And this is where it need not actually even be bias. It could just be noise. So Daniel Kahneman has been talking a lot in recent years about noise. And there are recent studies which look at, basically they wrote up vignettes, very clear vignettes of people in this situation. Here's a couple, here's their investment situation, here's what they've got. Here are all the details a financial advisor would need to come up with the right answer. And then they gave these vignettes to several hundred, might even have been in excess of 1,000 in one of the cases, several hundred advisors, and said, on these clear objective dimensions, tell me what you would suggest this person does, how much risk, how much liquidity, various things. And they looked at the answers that arose. And this might not come as a surprise to you, but they were all over the place. Because humans are just irredeemably bad at processing lots of information in various moving parts and weighing it up in the context of a complex environment and getting it right. And so in order to do that, you need to have tools that are going to provide objective inputs into that process, hence our use of psychometric assessments to assess some bits of each individual's personality. And we can do that for different individuals in a couple, in a family. So you can actually look at it individually or collectively. And then we have tools to say, let me bring all of this together to try and eliminate some of that subjectivity of the advisor. One of the things you talk about the Giga Renzer program, early things. I think it was his. I can't remember what was the very early book he wrote on this. Doesn't matter.
I'll find it. Put it in the notes.
But there are these things where if you give humans a choice where there are 20 attributes that matter, and whatever the options can vary on these 20 attributes, invariably you can demonstrate that although humans think they're weighing up all 20, actually they're only looking at the top 2 or 3. And so if an advisor is faced with many more than 20 things coming in, chances are, although they think they're giving a holistic view, they're only actually weighing their answers on a few of those, and it might not be the same few each time. So the potential for inconsistency is just overwhelming. So to use tools, decision support tools, we sometimes call them decision prosthetics, tools to increase objectivity, to help humans process many moving parts and to reduce subjectivity. That helps us get to the right answer. And here I mean right answer, not just for financial needs, but right answer that also helps me to balance out my need for emotional comfort versus my long-term need for financial efficiency.
And I love that you guys are doing this work with psychometrics and assessing individual differences, because I think, and I've had many conversations with colleagues and partners over the last couple of years about this. A lot of my training was in sort of personality and individual differences psychology as well, and a lot of the work I do currently is in psychometrics, and I love it, and I feel that the field of applied behavioral science and behavioral economics has actually done a disservice to that other half of the Lewinian equation, which is the personality and the situation leads to the behavior. I think we've done a great job of the context and of the environment, be it digital, social, or physical environment. But what we've sort of been very silent on, and even the individual differences in personality psychologists have been rather quiet on as well, is this stuff of individual differences and using psychometrics. So is that, what was the what was the impetus to get that involved in the work that you guys do? I know you sort of talked about it, but
Mm.
given that it wasn't a thing in our field, like how did you guys make it happen, and where was that initial interest coming from?
Well, it started actually from within from a need in financial services, in financial advice.
Hmm.
So there is a need for financial advisors to assess the risk tolerance of their clients. How
Mm-hmm.
much risk are you willing to take? And that, alongside how much risk you are able to take, is a big dimension of the right answer for you, as it were. And so we started out first going, actually, most of the tools out there to assess people's risk tolerance are abysmal, because people kind of come up with a few questions, and
Yeah.
in the Kahneman fast and slow thing, if you ask people, what is your long-term willingness to trade off risk and return of the outcomes of your portfolio for your total net wealth, it's too difficult a question for people to answer. So they substitute another one, which is, how do I feel about taking risk this morning? Now, how I feel about taking risk this morning is an incredibly bad basis on which to build someone a 10-year portfolio. So
Yeah.
we started by going, how do we better measure someone's risk tolerance in a really empirically robust way?
Mm.
And in doing so, we thought, well, hang on, maybe there are other aspects of financial personality that might be stable and measurable, because we know there's a big five out there, and we know that there are certain sub-dimensions of those. And as you get more and more detailed, the stability of your measure starts to drop off, but the precision with which you might do something with that, if you have a strong signal from that measure, is
Mhm.
amplified. So we started looking for that, and this was way back in 2007. We did a bunch of psychometric studies and managed to come up with a financial personality assessment that measured risk tolerance in a very robust way, but also measured 5 other uh, measurable aspects of someone's personality traits that seemed to be particularly applicable to investing behavior.
Mhm.
So one of them, for example, is composure. Your tendency towards emotional engagement with the here and now, your tendency towards being an anxious person, basically. And that is ultimately derived from one of the subscales of the neuroticism scale of the Big Five.
Mhm.
And yet we thought, we can measure this. This is one that seems to have particular application in the problem we're looking at. How do we help people to get to better investment outcomes? And so once we started getting those scales, we then spent the next 10 years figuring out what to do with them, because there was no theory in finance to tell you why or where a composure score should matter.
Mhm. Mhm. And is that where the sort of with Oxford Risk as the software solutions and technology, like, is that where layering in the technology comes into play, to sort of see what you can then do with these different
Yes.
personalities?
Yeah. So the first step is the measurement, the personality measurement, which will, we like to think we do in a very academically robust and empirically robust way. But that actually, then you can send someone a PDF and go, well, hey, look at your personality. Isn't that interesting? Um, what really matters is what you do with that next. So,
Mm.
how that weaves into the algorithms that go, here's how I adjust the right risk level for you based on your composure score. Here's how I plug this into a content management system so that when the markets plunge this week, I can go to my client relationship management system, my CRM system,
Mhm.
and I can filter through the entire client base, looking for those clients that have a combination of low composure, high impulsivity, low financial comfort, and whose portfolios have dropped in the last week. And in addition, I might want to know who of them have logged in to see the value of their portfolio this weekend.
Mm.
So for different subsets of your clients, I can start to very quickly in real time give them the message that is right for their personality and their
Mm.
situation in a way that will nudge them towards better behavior in an appropriate way at that moment.
Wow, that's pretty cutting edge in terms of like these little interventions, we'll call them self nudges that are highly tailored and based off of these psychometrically robust measures. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I will say that I think uh, we're doing some very interesting stuff there, but we and the industry at large is still very much in the starting blocks with this.
Yeah.
Because, yeah, as you
Yeah.
say, it requires weaving in the whole individual differences thing, with a conception of financial model of what good behavior looks like, with a conception of how much do I allow you to deviate from good behavior in order to purchase emotional comfort, with the technology and the data. So there's lots and lots still to do in this sphere.
Yes, here. We'll have a job for some while then, yeah.
I certainly hope so.
So, Greg, one final question for you. Called the BBB, or the Big Behavioral Brainstorm. I ask all my guests the end of each chat or episode. So, of all the problems that exist in society and business today, which one, if you had to choose only one, do you think could benefit or stand to gain from a psychological or behavioral related intervention?
Yeah, I'm so tempted to say climate change because I just think it is so systemically important. But equally, I'm not convinced that I know what to do about it enough with behavioral science. So I'm going to choose savings behavior, financial well-being. How do we encourage people to consume more responsibly and save more responsibly? And it's an area that I think is very important because it's something that as an industry we do very badly. It's something people keep throwing nudges at, and I think they're throwing them in the wrong direction. And here's the reason why. Better savings behavior isn't about building a savings account with a lot of behavioral bells and whistles on it and running a randomized control trial to say, hey, presto, look, we save more into this account than the other. Because firstly, there are all sorts of issues with your randomized control trial requires a hermetically sealed environment, and what about the unintended consequences outside of that? But the bigger problem is savings behavior is about the complexity of your financial existence. And we're in an interesting situation where the entire financial industry places almost all of the decision burden of navigating your finances to the end consumer. So we are all expected through the course of our lives to cobble together our own financial system. You go to university and you get your current account, and then later you add on a savings account, and you get a credit card over there somewhere, and then later you get your 401k if you're in the US. Even if you know what you're doing, there is no reason to assume that any one of us have chronologically cobbled together a system that is efficient and optimal. And then we've got all these accounts and pots that are badly designed and badly put together. And the end consumer is the one that has to do all the work about how much money do I move from here to there? When do I move it? Someone who saves £200 at the end of the month, what do they do with that money? Well, I could put it in my savings account. I could move it to my pension. I could pay down my brother-in-law. I could pay off my credit card. There's all sorts of things I can do with it. And it's incredibly complex. And most people do nothing and end up spending more as a result. What we need to focus on is helping to build financial systems where we can build in a system that is efficient, so the containers are sensibly put together, and stop focusing on selling people financial products, but sell people an ecosystem of things that work together across their whole financial existence and help them to automate sensible flows between them. The real value is in helping people to gradually configure and automate their financial systems such that they can set it up once well, and then it starts to work in their favor thereafter. And I think if we can start taking a systems-based approach to the savings problem, rather than adding bells and whistles onto savings accounts, we'll be in a much better position to solve this problem.
I love that you've, at the end there, you sort of say we need to take the systems-based approach. I think that's true for all the work we do. But as you so nicely laid out there, it's so justified to have in financial well-being for your average individual. Well, Greg, thanks so much for coming on. As I said, as in the beginning of the show, as the first formal behavioral finance expert, you did a remarkable job of walking us through what this exciting work is doing, and really pointing out how much more work there needs to be done, which is super exciting for the field. Well, thanks again for coming on, Greg. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Hey, Nick here once more. A final farewell note before ending. All the show notes, links to papers, resources, and materials mentioned in the episode can be found on the BS podcast page of The Behaviorist. where you can find all episodes and lots of other interesting and easy to apply sciencey stuff. Just go to www.behaviorist.biz/BS podcast. The show is edited and co-produced by Laura Christine and Noelle Rain, and all visual artwork, banners, and animated GIFs are created by the talented Iris Deng of dengit.org. That's DENGIT.org. Check it out. And lastly, if you'd like to join me in the mission of spreading the good BS word, remember to rate and review the show on iTunes. A lot of work goes into these episodes, and a little love would go a long way. Thanks again for listening. Until next time, remember, keep your facts ugly and your hypotheses beautiful.